It's Monster Mondays with me, Geoff Arbuckle. It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. And I don't just want to talk about giant monsters like Godzilla or King Kong. I also want to talk about the Universal monsters, as well as all the others that make up the rich history of the creature feature. And for this week, I want to tie in another thing that I dearly love, comic books. I'm going to talk about 1982's Swamp Thing, but I think it's best to start by talking about the character himself. Swamp Thing was created by writer Len Wein and artist Bernie Wrightson. He first appeared in a horror comic published by DC Comics called House of Secrets. His first comic was the 92nd issue of that series, cover dated July of 1971. Now, the character proved to be quite popular, so much so that Swamp Thing's backstory was tweaked a bit from his first appearance and brought into the present day. His origin story actually took place in the early 1900s. Swamp Thing is a scientist named Alec Holland, who was working on a secret bio-restorative formula in the Louisiana swamplands. Basically, a couple of bad guys come in and try to steal the formula, but an explosion happens and the formula mixes with Holland and the swamp together into one monster creature named Swamp Thing. Now, 1971 must have been a moment in the collective consciousness of the human race, because just before Swamp Thing's first appearance in House of Secrets came out, Marvel had their own swamp creature called Man-Thing. yeah, Man-Thing. That's a joke that just writes itself now, doesn't it? Anyway, I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure if there was a little bit of corporate competition shenanigans that brought Marvel and DC to both create swamp monsters at the same time, or if it just so happened to be coincidence. But enough about the insert penis joke here, man, and let's get back to the monster that sounds like my butt crack in my underwear on a 98-degree Indiana summer day. Swamp Thing was sort of popular. In the 70s, he stuck around for a handful of years. In 1982, a movie was going to come out based on the character. It was directed by Wes Craven. Yes, that Wes Craven. It was relatively cheap, only budgeted for about $2.5 million. And Craven could work cheap and was reportedly very proud to deliver the movie not only on time, but also on budget. DC wanted to capitalize on the movie and launched Saga of the Swamp Thing, a new series to keep the character's story rolling. But about 20 issues in, the reins were handed over to comic writer Alan Moore, who would eventually become a giant in the industry.
My name's Alan Moore. I write comics.
And he was relatively new to American comics at the time. So for the next 40-plus issues, Moore would completely turn Swamp Thing's backstory on its head. Instead of the original idea of Holland being a man turned into a monster, Swamp Thing would discover that he was actually a creation of a powerful elemental force that only absorbed Holland's memories and was never really human to begin with.
Quite extraordinary. When I was asked to take over the book, one of the things that I was asked was, what do you want to do with the character? And I started thinking about it and trying to come up with a way in which we could make him more of a Swamp Thing.
It's heartbreaking and utterly fascinating to read. That bit of awesomeness was reverted back to the original idea of Swamp Thing being Holland transformed into a monster at some point afterwards. But Swamp Thing is still around the DC universe today. And if I could give some personal commentary, a solo series starring the character is sorely missing from DC's lineup of titles currently.
I suppose it's a bit cynical and manipulating, but I do like to try and put my finger upon the exact nerve, if possible, of what really scares people. It's sadism and I'm getting paid for it, you know.
The movie is relatively simple. It begins with Alice Cable, played by Adrienne Barbeau, arriving at a top-secret facility in the swamp. In the comics, the character is actually Matt Cable, a longtime friend of Alec Holland and Swamp Thing. She meets Alec and his sister, two hotshot botanists who are working on a restorative formula. Alec sees Adrienne Barbeau and is like, whoa, she is stacked and hot, and immediately falls in love with her.
An outrageous pair.
But this is a good time to also talk about Swamp Thing's most enduring villain, Arcane. In both the comics and this movie, he's a scientist obsessed with power. I think in the comics he's more about immortality and gets pretty into demonic shit and actually turns into a gross-ass Lovecraft type of monster. But he also has a real cute niece named Abby, who more really helps build a love story between her and Swamp Thing that even involved them having real trippy sex scene that involves a sweet potato that he grows from his body for her to eat and sync their emotions and erotic touchy bits and stuff. It's fucking awesome, and I'll just leave it at that. Go and discover that for yourself.
I feel very smug about that. I sort of hug myself in the middle of the night when I think about that.
In the movie now, Arcane is played by Louis Jourdan, just a year away from being the villain in Octopussy. He wants the Holland's formula to, I guess he ultimately wants to have this stuff so that he can grow plants all over the world and hold over the world's nations for ransom or something. I'm not entirely sure, but once he and his henchmen bust in to take the formula, he kills Alec's sister, and Alec gets set on fire with this formula and dives into the swamp to change the Swamp Thing. In the end, Arcane turns himself into an alligator sort of wolfman thing, and he and Swamp Thing beat the shit out of each other until Swamp Thing, no crap, stabs Arcane with a sword that looks kind of like Excalibur. These are things that happen in this movie, and it's fucking balls awesome.
Government agents, scientists, soldiers, master criminals, secret formulas, monsters, and midgets.
Now, let's talk about the three things, the stuff that I really like and can boil down the essence as for why I can watch this movie at any time and rewatch it and recommend to others to watch it. First, it's a real simple movie. This was in the early days of comic book adaptations into film.
I don't think that a lot of the films that are coming out about comic book characters are helping any. I'd like to see someone do a really serious film that was as well written as the comics are sometimes. You know, I mean, I think that would be nice, but I've not got any real hope of it happening.
It's a really good example of the era that it came from. In the early 80s, the comic book industry was in what is known as the Bronze Age of comics. It was a time in which comics were starting to be less for little kids and more for slightly bigger kids and young adults. Restrictions set forth by the Comics Code Authority, the self-censoring group that comic publishers would have to appeal to for stories to be released, was really loosening up quite a bit. There was also some independent publishers out there that was starting to capture the readership of slightly older people. So you'd have these stories with ideas that were more fitting for horror than superheroes, but the stories were still basic and relatively simple. Swamp Thing used Beauty and the Beast to have him care for and protect Alice, but also having Alice able to see the man Alec Holland was underneath all that goopy, veiny grossness of the monster that he became. Now, being the era of movies, it's also a man in a rubber suit, and that's just simply awesome. Second, this was the heyday of Adrienne Barbeau enticing and exciting pubescent boys and adults alike.
Much beauty in the swamp, if you only look.
Between 1980 and 1982 alone, she'd appear in The Fog, Escape from New York, The Cannonball Run, Swamp Thing, and Creepshow. All classics of the early 80s, and in many cases, she was typically the bright spot in the entire production. She was always sassy, funny, sexy, and also, I think it probably skeevy, but nonetheless important to mention, that Swamp Thing is rated PG, and she has a moment in which she's bathing in the swamp and is actually legit topless. From that point forward in the movie, Wes Craven was probably like, let's just not have her wear a bra again. Okay, cool? Cool. All right. I'm telling you, the 80s were awesome, guys.
Adrienne Barbeau and the Swamp Thing, an outrageous pair in the incredible adventure that grows on you.
Finally, there's Dick Durock's portrayal of Swamp Thing. Now, Durock was mostly known as a stuntman, but he played Swamp Thing numerous times, including a sequel to this movie that I will probably someday discuss, and a television series in the early 90s. In fact, he is the only person to have ever played Swamp Thing in a live-action movie or series. For many kids of the 80s and 90s, he is what comes to mind when somebody says Swamp Thing. In that sequel and in the series, he would get a chance to speak more clearly and act a little bit more. In this movie, he mostly speaks in fairly broken sentences, almost like how the character's dialogue is written in the comics, with pauses and spacing between words and phrasing.
Family Orchidaceae. Genus Orcus. Over 100 species here.
He is the man who became the Swamp Thing for pretty much all of us monster kids of the 80s. All right, so it's time to put a lid on this installment of Monster Mondays. Swamp Thing may be a little silly and dated for some looking for deeper or more adult entertainment, but I do offer a couple of retorts. First of all, it is a fun watch to be sure. And where else are you going to see a swamp monster and an alligator wolfman thing punch each other in the fucking face? Well, the answer to that is nowhere. Swamp Thing did it. No other movie could do it ever since. So until next week, see you later, and don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com. And also check out new posts at my website, B Movie Enema, each and every Friday. Until next week, so long.